And so a quick Destiny 2 news video of sorts today, and Steam published their Best of 2023 list, which includes the top games on the platform measured by gross revenue in the last year. It turns out that Destiny actually is in the Platinum list right here, so that puts it in the top 12 games on Steam, making it one of the highest revenue generating titles on the platform, and that's in the mix with huge titles like Apex Legends, PUBG, Baldur's Gate, and of course Starfield that launched this year, and obviously that had a very strong initial launch despite complaints about the game overall. And so looking at the first part of this year, Bungie had done very well, and the assumption would be that the majority of this success came with the Lightfall expansion in February. In fact, looking at some of the Steam charts, in March 2023, there was an average player count of 135,000, with the launch of Lightfall in February peaking at 312,000 players, and that is the highest player count on Steam since October 2019. So at the start of this year, Destiny had more players than it had had for a number of years. And comparing March 2023 at 135,000 average players, that's actually around 55% higher than March 2022 immediately after Witch Queen, which by player standards was a significantly better expansion. And so clearly, post-Lightfall, there's been a fairly significant issue in retaining players given what we're hearing about Bungie's revenue miss. And there'll always be drop-off, of course, following a major expansion, but given the reception to Lightfall's story in particular, that drop looks to have hit much harder than in previous years, such as after Witch Queen. And we heard reports from Bloomberg of a 45% revenue miss in the game, despite Destiny having statistically performed very well versus other titles. And so it's interesting, and we may be asking the question, how has this happened? Well, of course, firstly, we should keep in mind that the revenue target is one set by Bungie, and they perhaps expected Destiny to continue to grow and perform well over the year, as it did in the Witch Queen year. And of course, when Witch Queen dropped, and in previous years, as well as having good expansions, we were at the tail end of the pandemic, where a lot of folks were still stuck at home, and clearly overall, people have been spending more money on video games. And that isn't in effect anymore, so across multiple industries, including gaming, there's been a big drop-off. But it would also appear that this revenue slope wasn't really predicted by Bungie, or was somewhat ignored. And on top of that, Bungie clearly hadn't anticipated that player sentiment toward Destiny would suffer significantly in the year of Lightfall, which essentially highlights that the studio thought the title was going to continue to perform as well as it had in previous years, or indeed, to do even better. And in the year following Witch Queen, Sony of course acquired Bungie, and it kind of looks like the higher-ups at the studio may well have inflated their revenue expectations in order to secure a deal with the gaming giant. And between inflated expectations or promises, as well as the natural revenue slope post-pandemic, and probably worse, the big drop in player satisfaction around Destiny, this is where that 45% miss comes into play. And on that basis, it also seems unlikely that Destiny will be in this Platinum list for 2024. I guess time will tell, but going back in time a little bit, even when Destiny has been performing well, we've heard various reports about finances at Bungie, like when Microsoft considered buying the studio, but that stated that the company had too high of a burn rate, meaning that they were essentially spending too much money and ultimately eating into too much of their profit margin. And there was even a similar situation when Forsaken dropped back in the day. We all know how successful that expansion was, but for Activision, the publisher at the time, they had stated that Forsaken had missed the mark in terms of profits generated. And so Bungie for a long time have been putting themselves in a difficult situation because Destiny is a very expensive game to produce, and that's always meant that Bungie have to generate a significant amount of cash in order to continue to produce the game. And on the most part, they've done that, but ultimately, when Bungie separated from Activision, the publisher hadn't taken kindly to the idea of Bungie producing multiple titles. And so even going back quite a few years now, there's an indication that Activision perhaps saw this issue coming down the road, where Bungie ultimately wouldn't be able to afford to make various titles and also produce Destiny. Then of course, a bit later on, Microsoft stated that Bungie was burning through cash too quickly for its partnership to be fruitful, and they essentially saw acquiring Bungie as too much of a significant risk. But at the time that this was going on, of course, Bungie were expanding its workforce, they had more developers than ever, they were also spending a massive amount of money on the headquarters, and they'd started working on other IPs, with Marathon being the main upcoming title. And so perhaps overall it looks like Bungie were maybe not in a position to do that unless Destiny could make a ridiculous amount of money. But of course then the interesting twist is that given all of this, Sony still went ahead with their purchase of Bungie, and they'd reportedly ensured that they'd got one thing covered. And according to various leaks, Sony's deal stipulates that if Bungie doesn't meet their agreed targets, that Sony can essentially clear out the board at Bungie and put their own people in charge of the studio. So Sony definitely had that security in place. And I think it's possible that Sony knew this was likely to happen, which essentially means that, from Sony's perspective, if Bungie didn't make a ton of cash from Destiny and the upcoming titles, they have that security of being able to use the Bungie studio for anything they like, essentially. They presumably acquired Bungie's assets, the new studio, and all of the dev talent, and we should remember that Bungie is full of world-class developers, and that allows Sony to do a lot of things within their umbrella, even if they ultimately aren't Bungie's original titles like Destiny or Marathon. And also, given that Bungie went into the Sony deal after becoming fully independent a few years back, it probably demonstrates that Bungie had already run into significant issues with cash, enough that they gave up their independence in order to land in Sony's safety net. But of course, as we've learned, that safety net appears to be a short-term save for the OG Bungie, and there's also a move that could, and likely will, spell an end to a somewhat independent Bungie, so it's an interesting situation. However, it comes to be the case that despite being one of the best-selling games in the world this year, it's still missed by a big chunk, and as we know, Destiny is now on pretty thin ice going into 2024. And so it's going to be an interesting year ahead to see what happens with the final shape, see how the game performs, and to see ultimately what happens to Bungie, because I think a lot of things will unfold over the next few months. And I've thought this for a little while. It makes me wonder whether Bungie have tried to go too fast in terms of producing other IPs, but also whether their expectations and ambitions have essentially put them in a really difficult situation, when they could have perhaps doubled down on Destiny given how successful it has been, worked on improving the quality of the game over time, while also managing how much money they have to spend on the title, without throwing a ton of it into a new studio or into new IPs. It would appear that at the high end, Bungie haven't really taken the learnings from the first few years of Destiny and used that to plot something more sustainable over time, but instead have invested into a lot of other things. And of course, now we're in a situation where Destiny isn't performing as expected. And despite Bungie's big plans for stuff in the future, Destiny is their security. Very weird situation, but there we go, guys. That's what I wanted to report on today. Destiny's still making it into the top 12 platinum titles on Steam in terms of revenue generated. And that does encompass all of the revenue the game makes, whether it's silver, microtransaction stuff, pre-orders for expansions, purchases of existing stuff, seasons, and so on. And given that Destiny has still found itself in that position after all these years, it certainly further indicates some of these squandered opportunities, one of the big ones being that Bungie could have doubled down and cut fewer corners when it comes to producing Destiny content, and also slowed down on their ambitions for upcoming titles, and perhaps they would be in a much better situation than they are currently, but there's certainly a degree of speculation. We can only base this on what we have seen and the reports and leaks that we've had. But as always, I'd be curious to get your thoughts down in the comment section, guys. Just thought it was an interesting one to discuss with you all, so let us know what you think down below. But if you've enjoyed the video, a rating below very much helps us out on the channel, and if you're new around here, be sure to get subscribed for more Destiny content. But otherwise, I will catch you guys very soon.